I'm the President and CEO of the Amputee Coalition. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar today. We're very excited about this webinar for new amputees on what you need to know about prosthetics. Today, I'll do a couple of housekeeping things here. We are recording this webinar and we will be posting it on our website so that it can be viewed at a later date. I'm going to start the recording now. In addition, I want you to know that we will handle questions at the end of the webinar. On your screen on the right-hand side is a question button that you can push, and you can type in your question, and our presenter will answer questions at the end. So let's, without any further discussion, let's get going. I'd like to welcome you all. Our presenter today is Brian Fraser. Brian is representing Biome, and we're very pleased to be doing this webinar with Biome today. Brian is a certified prosthetist and the Director of Clinical Education at Biome. Prior to joining them in 2010, Brian had over 22 years of experience in advanced prosthetics as a world-class amputee athlete. Brian is a certified prosthetist and a bionic clinical expert. He has spent the last 9 years working with prosthetic manufacturers to advance bionic technology by providing input to the R&D team and fine-tuning devices in the marketplace. As an amputee athlete, engineer, and prosthetist, Brian has a unique understanding of how advanced technologies interface with the biomechanics of the body. Brian has a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from North Carolina State, and he received his ABC certification from Northwestern University. I'd like you to please welcome Brian Fraser.
Well, thank you, Susan. And we're just going to get switched over on the screen here. And so I'd just like to echo Susan's comments as well. I'd like to welcome you all to the presentation and thank you for taking the time out of your day to be with us. I know it's hard to fit these kind of things in during your busy workday and whatnot, but hopefully this is going to be an informative session for you. And to kind of give you an idea, this is just going to be a general overview about really what to expect for new amputees. This could be some of you that are getting ready to go through an amputation or you've just been through an amputation. And so we just want to kind of give you a general overview. And then, as Susan said, we'll take some questions at the end. So we'll go ahead and get started. Just to give you a little overview on what we will cover today, we'll start off talking a little bit about amputation statistics, choosing your certified prosthetist. That's obviously a very important process. And then we'll go into, give you an idea of what that initial prosthetic consult or your first visit will be like. We are going to talk a little bit about technology today. We won't get super in-depth with that, but just to kind of give you a general sense about what's out there and maybe what is appropriate for what type of situation. And then the last thing that we'll talk about is a little bit about maintaining your fit and also sort of empowering yourself in regards to the knowledge that you have about prosthetics. So tying a little bit to my personal experience into this, when I lost my leg, I was 19 years old. And at that time, I was a track athlete for North Carolina State University. The term amputation was very foreign to me. And to me, probably one of the worst things that could have happened was me to lose my left foot. And as most of you probably know if you've been through an amputation, when that occurs, when you go through that process, you feel like you're the only one in the world dealing with that. But believe it or not, there's about 2 million of us in the United States. So it's a relatively large group, probably larger than most of us would think. And there's actually about 185,000 amputations a year. Now that's all amputations. That's going to include digit amputations or fingers and toes. But if we look at probably what's pertinent to us, which is going to be lower extremity amputations, and also including upper extremity amputations in there too would add to that number. But there's about 75,000 of those a year. So you're definitely not the only one out there. Now, if we look at the cause of amputation, this is somewhat surprising to a lot of people who aren't familiar with prosthetics or the world of amputation. I know as working for a manufacturer, I get the question a lot, oh wow, when the wars broke out, that must have really increased the number of amputees that you guys see. But believe it or not, there's only been about 1,500 amputations with the soldiers across 10 years of wartime. And then if you look at the primary cause for amputation, you see there it's mainly due to vascular disease. So these are going to be folks that have conditions like diabetes or poor circulation. About the other half of that's going to be trauma. And most of those tend to be males because they tend to be more the risk takers. And then cancer represents about only 1%. So level of amputation, this really is going to break down into whether or not your amputation occurred above the knee, below the knee, or whether it was an upper extremity amputation. Now, of course, bilateral could be multiple amputations, and here we show the statistic for lower limb amputations or leg amputations. But you can see there the lion's share of amputations is going to be distributed to the below the knee. And that number used to be much higher in years past. It used to be about a 55% representation for below the knee amputations. But what we're seeing is that there's more above knee amputations now due to the fact that those vascular diseases are getting more progressive, and so they have to come higher up on the limb to find good circulation for the limb to survive. So obviously the primary question that most of us have after an amputation is, what's next? What can I expect after an amputation? So if we look at some of the milestones that typically occur after an amputation, most of you, if you've been through this process or you're going to go through this process, the first thing that really happens is rehabilitation after the surgery. So the time for this really just varies. It depends on the individual, what their condition was going into the surgery, how successful the surgery was, and then what sort of program their physician and therapist have set up for them. But this usually is going to be anywhere from 2 weeks to a month in regards to time for rehabilitation. And at that point, during that time, you probably would have received a visit from your prosthetist if that has been decided yet. And that person will have set up a sort of a timeline for you to begin the prosthetic fit, which of course the first one is going to be the first visit in their office. So that will be your first consult. And then the other thing that's going to determine how long this process takes, and we'll get more into this specifically as we move through the presentation, but the limb maturity will certainly dictate a lot of that, how quickly your limb stabilizes, and then you can move into what we consider the permanent fitting, and that's really the prosthesis that we consider is your final prosthesis and that you will be using for years to come. And then, of course, the ultimate goal in all of this is to try to get you back to doing your activities of daily living. Obviously, this is going to vary from patient to patient, and these are discussions and goals that should be set early on in the process because they will certainly determine and dictate a lot of the things that will happen from the time of your amputation to the time that you return to doing those activities of daily living. So choosing your prosthetist. So this, of course, isn't an exact science, but what we wanted to do was give you just a few suggestions and bullets on what might help you make that decision. And it's probably going to be one of the most important decisions that you make outside of the surgeon who's obviously doing your amputation. But some of the things you do want to consider in regards to working with a prosthetist is first the reputation of that individual and of the company that they work for. So this could be done online. You could do some research in regards to the company. You could actually talk with the prosthetist. I mean, you could almost consider this somewhat of an interviewing process because you want to make sure that the person has appropriate experience and that also you're going to mesh well with them in that relationship. Because the thing to understand, unlike most healthcare relationships, you could potentially have a lifelong relationship with your prosthetist, which is very different from what we see typically in other healthcare situations. So in regards to that, what's also important is the credentials of that person. So the certification and the licensure may or may not be required. Certification is basically their personal personal qualifications. So this would be the fact that they've gone through the education process, taken their boards and exams and passed those. Licensure is basically that's available in some states, or required rather in some states. And this is basically sort of government regulation that's put in place to protect the patient. So licensure in states just basically means that the government's going to have certain requirements for that person to practice in that profession in that particular state. So not all states in the U.S. have licensure in regard to prosthetics, but a lot of websites, probably even the ACA, and Sue can confirm this later, probably has a listing of which states do require licensure. So experience is obviously very important. How many years of experience, but then what kind of experience do they have as well? Some prosthetists have particular experience in different types of fittings, such as there's maybe a specialist in upper extremity, or they may be a specialist in bionic technology. So those are important things to inquire about. Another important factor is the proximity to your home. This, you have to keep in mind, especially early on in the process, you will have more fittings as you're trying to get the perfect fit for your prosthesis. And so this needs to be practical for you in regards to being able to make those appointments. So I mentioned before, do they have a particular expertise in technology? This might be particularly important to you depending on what your ultimate goals are with the prosthesis. I'll use myself as an example there. I mean, due to the fact that I was an elite track athlete when I had my amputation, I wanted to return to the Paralympics, so I knew that this was going to require a very certain set of skills in regards to my prosthetist and a certain amount of knowledge in the realm of sports prosthetics for me to be able to go back to doing that. And so the last thing would be the questions that he or she asks you. So this is very important because this is how they're really going to understand the type of prosthesis that they need to build for you, what technology is going to be best for you. And so making sure that there's clear communication about what your goals are for that prosthesis and what you want to be able to return to doing again with the prosthesis is critically important. So if we talk about that initial prosthetic consult, just to kind of give you an idea of generally what occurs during that first visit, most prosthetists are going to do a pretty comprehensive exam. After they get that detailed background information about you, they're going to really sort of evaluate where you are at the time. They need to know what your general health is at the time. They also need to know what your general physical condition is at the time. So simple tests that they'll do to sort of evaluate strength and your range of motion, even evaluating the capability with your upper extremity, because even if you're a lower extremity amputee, your upper body strength and your dexterity are still very important, because those things will determine how well you can put the prosthesis on, what type of liners you can deal with, what kind of suspension might be most appropriate for you. And what is your sound side condition? So that would be if you're a unilateral amputee or you had one leg amputated. Is your other side in good condition, or is it compromised as well? We're going to talk more specifically about evaluating the limb and developing the socket, because that's obviously probably arguably the most important process of building a prosthesis. And do you have other comorbidities? And so are there other things going on with you physically outside of the amputation? And often we do find that is the case with folks who have diabetes. They often have heart conditions and other health problems going on that need to be considered. So that's why we look heavily at what caused your amputation. We sort of talked earlier about the importance of setting goals. And if you look at these last three bullets on the right, I would say that two of those are critically important to the overall success of you being able to return to those goals. And that is your motivation. How determined are you to get back to doing the things you did before? And then what is your support system? Because what we often find as practitioners is that the family is critically important to helping that person achieve those goals. So in my own experience, what I find sometimes is that the family can be the most important factor in that person achieving those goals, and sometimes they can even be a roadblock if the family's goals are not really in line with the patient's goals. So really kind of getting that proper support system. And again, for myself, I felt very lucky in that for me to return to being a Paralympic athlete again, I needed the right team around me, which ultimately consisted of my physician, my prosthetist, my family and friends, and my coach to get back to doing that. And so I felt like I was able to surround myself with a very positive support system who were all contributing to helping me get to the goals that I had set for myself. So rehabilitation goals. So this is just sort of an overview. We'll talk more specifically about this, but you are going to have short-term goals, medium-term goals, and long-term goals. And each one of these stages represents phases that we like to achieve in order to ultimately get you back to doing those activities of daily living. So the next very common and popular question is, what technology is good for me? And this isn't exactly an easy answer to, or an easy question to answer, because if any of you have done any sort of research on prosthetics, you'll know that there are a lot of components or prosthetic components to choose from out there. So what we'll kind of do is break it down into very large generic groups and sort of give you an idea of what those groups are and what they represent, what they do. But let's first talk about the prosthetic design. And again, this is just sort of an overview slide to sort of give you what the typical stages of prosthetic fittings represent. So first is what might happen, may or may not happen, is that the physician may choose to have the prosthetist apply what we call an IPOP, or an immediate postoperative prosthesis. So this is a prosthesis that goes on directly after the surgery. It's a plaster cast basically that's wrapped on your limb, as you see here, and then they attach a pylon in a foot, the very basic pylon in the foot. And this was really just meant to do several things. It was meant to help control the swelling of the limb. It's also made to keep your knee straight, because you don't want to sit around with your knee bent for too long after your amputation, because you could develop what we call a knee flexion contracture, or if you're an above the knee amputee, a hip flexion contracture. And these are the shortening of the muscles and tendons, which could cause your joints to freeze in that position, which obviously we don't want to happen. So it may be used to keep the knee or hip, or in this case, most of the time it's just the knee, the post-op or below knee amputees, to keep the knee straight to prevent that. And it can also be used for some slight load bearing. So obviously we don't put all the pressure on this prosthesis because it's a fresh wound, your limb needs time to heal. But again, this is sometimes done, sometimes it's not. It's really a surgeon preference of whether or not this happens or not. And so typically what we do see most of the time is the first fitting is what a lot of prosthetists would call a preparatory prosthesis. The reason they call it a preparatory prosthesis is because they only intend for this prosthesis, and I should say really the socket, which is the part that your limb fits into, which you see here. They're only really expecting that to last 4 to 6 months. It maybe extends into a year depending on at what level the limb matures. But as far as considering it a preparatory prosthesis as the whole prosthesis, my personal preference was to choose a prosthetic foot that I felt like the patient was going to be best for based off of initial physical tests, versus choosing a lower grade foot and then changing the entire prosthesis out later. There are times where that might warrant that, to go from a low performing foot to a higher performing foot if the patient is really a low level ambulator in the beginning. But I really consider the preparatory part more of the socket fit than anything. And then finally, the ultimate goal is to get you into what we can call a definitive prosthesis, and that would, or a permanent prosthesis, as is sometimes said. And this is really a design that is meant to be fit once your limb is mature and stabilized. You're not seeing a bunch of changes in the volume of your residual limb on a day-to-day basis. And this was really designed to be fit for somebody who's going to use it for probably about 3 to 5 years. Again, that range can vary widely, but I would say on average, most definitive prosthetics are going to last about 3 to 5 years. So I like this statement. I use it a lot just because I'm an amputee, and I firmly believe this, that life begins with the socket for amputees. And for me, I don't really care what you put underneath the socket. If this socket doesn't fit appropriately and isn't relatively comfortable for you in your day-to-day activities, then it doesn't really matter what you have underneath it because you're not going to walk very well on the prosthesis. So the socket fit, as we mentioned before, is really sort of the skill and art level in regards to the prosthetist. And what determines the socket fit is going to be the anatomy and physical condition of the limb itself. There's lots of different types of limbs, which we'll talk a little bit about in just a second. But there's different shapes, there's different tissue types, and your socket fit is a process. So what I mean by that, especially the first one, because your limb is going to be changing a lot, and that's why we have this sort of temporary socket, and then ultimately when your limb stabilizes, you'll have a permanent socket fit. But that permanent socket fit, again, is very important. There may be several what we call check sockets, which are just diagnostic sockets that are used for the prosthetist to evaluate the fit of your limb. And to give you an example, again, of myself, us knowing that I wanted to go out and be a sprinter in the Paralympics again, we knew that the socket fit had to be spot on because when an individual sprints, you apply about 7 to 9 times force of your body weight through the limb. And so it actually required 9 check sockets for me to get the correct fit. But to the credit of my prosthetist, he hung in there, he stuck with it, and he worked hard, and we got a good fit. And believe it or not, I'm still in that same socket fit that I had 23 years ago. Now that's very uncommon. That generally doesn't happen. But what I did individually to make sure I could stay in that socket was I maintained my body weight. I never fluctuated more than 5 pounds. And that's crucial for an amputee. You have to understand that if your body weight changes, even 5 to 10 pounds, your limb will change with you. And that means your socket is not going to fit the same. So I maintain a consistent body weight, and then I exercise my limb. Your muscles in your limb that surround these bones here, you can still exercise them when you walk. You can contract your muscles, and so that helps keep the volume of my limb intact and stable. And this is why I was able to stay in the same socket and have a comfortable fit basically for about the last 23 years. But on average, it takes about 6 to 12 months before the limb matures. I'd say that's a pretty fair estimate. That's about how long it took for my limb to stabilize. But again, it will vary for people depending on their condition. So other things we look at in regards to the limb, I mentioned before, we talked about shape. Some limbs are conical or sort of pointy shaped. Some are more cylindrical or symmetrical. Some are bulbous, which means they would kind of jut out here at the end, which makes it a little bit more difficult to fit unless that does take better shape over time. There's different types of tissues. Some limbs are firm, some limbs are soft, some limbs are bony. So all of these things have to be considered by the prosthetist when they're thinking about what type of liner, which we'll talk about in a second, that they're going to choose you, and then what kind of socket fit they're going to apply to your limb. So we talked about the preparatory prosthesis. So again, this was sort of a prosthesis that was designed in mind to sort of get you by until your limb matures. So we still want to achieve a comfortable fit during this time, but we know that we're going to have to make changes to that socket over time because your limb is going to begin to shrink as some of that initial swelling from surgery goes down and as your muscles start to atrophy a little bit until they reach a stabilized volume. But during this time with your preparatory prosthesis, you are going to begin ambulating, you're going to begin walking, and this is where the second round of therapy usually comes into play as well. So again, this will depend on your payer or your insurance of really how much time they will pay for with you to go back to see the physical therapist. But during this time with the preparatory prosthesis, you will be working on gait training, which is basically working on how you walk, and then starting to move forward to trying to get back to doing some of those activities of daily living, with the ultimate goal of, if you are trying to go back to work, that being certainly one of the primary goals that you achieve. And then the definitive prosthesis, as we mentioned before, they usually don't fit this until your limb is mature. An obvious question will be, well, how do I know when that is? Most prosthetists will determine this by the number of socks. There are prosthetic socks that you'll put over your liner to help make the fit more snug inside of your socket. And when you're not having to add any more socks, most people maybe have to add 1 or 2 socks during the day just from normal volume changes. But if that's being consistent and you're not going up in your overall sock fit, so you're going wearing 5 socks and then 10 socks and then 15 socks, once that levels out, it's really a sign to the prosthetist that your limb has stopped shrinking. And so this is when they know it's time to do a definitive prosthesis. And as I mentioned before, these prosthetics are generally, this is really speaking about the whole prosthesis, the socket and the foot, on average are going to last between 2 and 5 years. But as I mentioned before, in my own case, you can see wide ranges of this in regards to prosthetics lasting much longer. So we also want to talk a little bit about what Medicare K levels are. And any of you that have Medicare are going to be very familiar with this in regards to your insurance. But it's important for everybody to understand in general, because private insurance companies use these levels, use these Medicare functional levels to really help determine what type of technology that you're qualified for. So these K levels speak to physical function, or what you're really able to do with the prosthesis. And there's 4 levels. K1 represents someone who's only going to use the prosthesis really for transfers. They're going to put it on to go from the bed to the bathroom, from the bed to the living room, but they really don't use the prosthesis much more than that. A K2 level is really somebody who we call a household ambulator. So K2 is, they may get out in the community some, but the real definitive term here is that they are a single speed ambulator. So what that means is that they can't vary their walking speed. Most of the time they may need an assistive device, crutches, or a walker or whatnot to be able to ambulate with the prosthesis. But they're not really doing much with the prosthesis outside of sort of walking at this constant speed. A K3 user is what we call a community ambulator, and this means that they can get out in the community and deal with a lot of the obstacles that we would typically see in that environment. Things such as stairs, curbs, ramps, hills. They can ambulate those things independently. They also do change their speeds throughout the day as a able-bodied person may do when they walk. And then the final stage there is the K4 ambulator. So this would be, K4 is obviously also a K3, but these are people who are kind of really doing high-level activities such as sports, high-impact activities. And the thing to understand here is that each one of these levels represent what you could qualify for in regards to prosthetic technology. But probably the most crucial, arguably, is K3. Because once you achieve a K3 level, you really have access to any prosthetic technology that is available. From there, it's going to be really determined upon what your needs are, whether that technology is appropriate for you or not, and of course getting it authorized or paid for by your insurance company. So we'll talk a little bit about the amputation levels, and for today's presentation I'm only going to speak to the primary amputation level, which is going to be below the knee and above the knee, or below the knee is sometimes called transtibial amputation, above the knee is sometimes called transfemoral amputation in the medical community. But if we look at transtibial amputees, again, we saw from that earlier slide that it represents the largest group of amputations done in the United States. And they are also arguably the most functional level of amputation. And that's mainly because of the fact that the knee joint is still intact. Obviously, once we lose the knee joint, as in above the knee amputations, walking becomes much more difficult. The knee is a complicated joint to mimic with prosthetic technology. And it also means you still have the function of your hamstrings and quad muscles, which is going to make ambulating much easier in regards to balance and stability. Now, even with this amputation, there is going to be a compromised sense of where your foot is in space. We call this proprioception. So that's just kind of you knowing where your foot is in relation to where you're placing it. And then, speaking to the process of how easy it is to fit a transtibial amputee, generally this is not a real difficult fit in most cases unless there's a unique situation going on with the patient, because you have good socket stability and control. And generally we're able to achieve good socket comfort with this as well, especially with the development of the gel liners that we'll talk a little bit more later, and the protection that they give the residual limb. So above the knee amputees or transfemoral amputees, so much higher level functional loss here, and that really goes to what I was speaking to before, because you've lost the knee joint, and you've also lost the function of your hamstrings and quads here. So the above the knee amputees are really relying on the muscles of their hip to control the prosthesis. So developing those muscles during your rehab is going to be very important to the overall functional level of the above knee amputee. But the socket stability and control is a little bit more challenging here, mainly due to the fact that with an above knee limb, you have a lot more soft tissue that you have to deal with as compared to a below the knee amputation. And so controlling that soft tissue can be a challenge. The socket comfort's a little bit compromised, and this is mainly due to the fact that above knee amputees have to sit on their prosthesis, and that isn't always comfortable. It's not that the design cannot be made to make this relatively comfortable, but it certainly is more of a challenge when the amputee is sitting for hours on end on the prosthesis. And so this just makes this a little bit more of a challenge for the prosthetist to achieve. So we talk about technology, and specifically about foot technology to begin with. We can really kind of break these down into 4 categories. So this first that we call elastomer, this is basically just a very simple, basic design. It's been around for a very long time. It's essentially just made of wood and rubber. So as you can imagine from those materials, some of the pros and cons of that design is going to be that it's going to be very durable. It's somewhat I would say it's a go-to foot for preparatory prosthesis a lot of the times, but its functional capabilities are compromised just due to the fact that wood and rubber do not have high energy storing and returning properties. And so this was generally designed for people who may have insurance problems or don't have the finances or not getting approved for a high-level prosthesis, or it could also be for somebody who's a very low functional walker who really isn't going to benefit from some of the higher level technology. So you see there when we talked earlier about the K1, K2 levels, this is why we have this technology sort of grouped into someone who might be classified as a single speed ambulator or a household ambulator, and they fall into that K1, K2 category. So the next group is going to be the carbon line of feet, and carbon technology was introduced in the mid-1980s, and this really sort of revolutionized the prosthetic industry because carbon has the ability to store and release energy. It's a flexible material once it's laid up with the resin and the cross layering of the patterns that they use in developing the prosthetic feet. And so this really allowed amputees to walk further with less energy, but there was still a pretty big metabolic deficit in compared to the able-bodied population, but this was a huge jump in prosthetic technology. And as you can see here, it also allows for high-level function in regards to high activities. This is why they're grouped into the K3, K4 category. So again, once you achieve that K3 classification, you have access to pretty much any foot technology that's out there. So the next in line in advancements was the introduction of using a microprocessor in an ankle and combining that with the carbon foot. So that was first launched in 2006. And really what the microprocessor does is this system has an articulating ankle joint. So you will have movement about the ankle axis, which gives you a larger range of motion. And the microprocessor basically controls that motion. So it really determines how the ankle moves when you traverse different types of terrain, such as hills and ramps and stairs. The ankle will move with you, and that will give you better balance and stability in those situations. And then sort of the latest progression in technology would be the addition of power in the ankle. So powered activation, this was really sort of a bionic product that combines a lot of these previous technologies, but then adds the element of power. So the concept here is to sort of replace the function of the calf muscle, and so that when you walk, you literally get push off at the end by a motor that's inside of the prosthesis, but then you're also, that's going to be coupled with the range of motion that you see in the microprocessor ankles as well. So again, as you can imagine, very different levels of technology, and all of these things as far as which one is best for you is determined on your physical condition, what your activities of daily living are, and of course, what your insurance will cover as well. So if we look at that same sort of breakdown with prosthetic knees, it's going to follow a very similar pattern. So we have different technologies that are grouped into the different K levels, really what sort of technology is qualified for which level. And we sort of really start from basic to advanced. So basic knee being what we would call a mechanical weight activated knee. So this is a very simple single axis knee system that essentially assures that the knee will stay locked whenever you put load onto or put pressure onto the prosthetic foot. So the mechanism will stay locked until you reach the toe and get ready to take a step off, and then it may release. A lot of these knees will also have a feature where you can just lock it into extension so that the knee could never possibly buckle. But then that will also mean that you have to walk with a locked knee or an extended knee. So that will certainly change your gait pattern. But some patients like that because they don't want the possibility of the knee ever buckling so that they won't fall. But again, this is going to be more of a concern for your K1, K2 patients, patients who are a little bit weaker, who don't have the musculature around the hip to help stabilize the knee. And so your next jump up in technology is going to be the mechanical knees that contain a hydraulic unit. And the hydraulic unit basically is used to determine stability. It can provide enhanced stability in the knee, but it can also control the swing of the knee when you're taking the step and your ankle passes through swing phase. It's going to control the rate at which that happens. So the hydraulic really, with the different ports and the way the fluid flows inside of the cylinder, is really going to determine that level of stability. It'll allow you to walk at various speeds. And so this is why it falls into that K3, K4 classification as far as functionality is concerned. It's a very durable device, really sort of all activities it's good for. And much like the prosthetic foot technology, we had the introduction of the microprocessor technology in knees. And again, most of these knees are still using a hydraulic unit as what you would see here. But the microprocessor is controlling how that hydraulic unit works. So what this allows us to have is a system that has enhanced stability, because the microprocessor is going to have better control over how those ports are opened and closed, and can sense basically a lot of times what activity the patient is doing, such as are they going downhill, and you'll get more stability when you're going downhill. And so this was sort of a, I like to call this a smart hydraulic knee a lot of times is the way you can think of this. And then finally, there was the introduction of power into prosthetic knees as well. And so this system uses a motor much like the powered foot system that we were talking about before. And what it will do is allow the patient to have powered swing and extension through swing phase. So it's sort of picking the foot up and powering it forward. But then it will also provide powered extension when they climb hills and some assist from sitting to standing. So again, these are going to be, your access to these technologies are going to be dependent upon your K level and your insurance coverage, and then really just what's appropriate for you. Which of these features do you need to really be able to achieve your activities of daily living? So that really kind of speaks to foot and knee technology. And we also want to talk a little bit about the other components, such as suspension and liners. So suspension is the mechanism that holds your prosthesis on. And there's several different types of suspension that your prosthetist could evaluate. And I really say evaluate because with any of these things, and I really should have mentioned this at the beginning of this sort of technology overview, is that what I've learned as an amputee and a prosthetist is that sometimes what works best for a patient only comes through trial and error. We can make a very educated guess about your physical condition and what you want to achieve about what technology may work for you, but sometimes you find things that you think might work and then they don't. And so some of this may have to come through some experiment, but having the base knowledge of these will really help you guide you into which direction you want to go. So in regards to the way we might hold a prosthesis on, you can see these different categories. You could have a strap, you could have a suspension sleeve, you could have a pin lock. We could do suction, which is basically a one-way valve that also in most cases combines a sleeve with it. And we have elevated vacuum. So again, each one of these are going to have pros and cons. For example, the strap is more of sort of a basic form of suspension. As you can see here, it's literally just a leather strap that's attached to the socket and then cups above the patella bone or your knee bone, and then has another strap that wraps around the thigh, and that's literally what holds the prosthesis on. Now, the benefits of this is that you have an open knee, so range of motion sometimes is enhanced, but a lot of times you also have a lot of pistoning or movement in the socket, so that can be detrimental to the comfort of the socket fit. It leads to more friction and possibly maybe more skin breakdown if the socket fit isn't very good. But the other side of this is that a lot of times patients may have very sensitive skin, so they may be allergic to or have rashes and whatnot in regards to some of the sleeves that are available. So to speak on sleeves, sleeves can come in different materials. They may be neoprene, they may be gel, they may be silicone, but essentially think of it as a knee sleeve that rolls over the top of the prosthesis and onto the thigh, and that is your suspension that really will create some suction inside of the socket. And again, you have to really sort of experiment with maybe what type of material you're using. A lot of prosthetists have different types of material sleeves. They may even have pieces of sleeves. And so that you may take a few of them home with you and put them in a safe area on your skin just to make sure you're not going to have some sort of skin reaction to that particular material. But by and large, most of these materials are what we call bioinert. So that means the material itself that we use in these sleeves for most people are going to work very well with the skin. So it's usually people that have very sensitive skin or some sort of condition that will literally have some sort of irritation from it outside of sweating, which is going to be a very common occurrence for any amputee, and it's just sort of one of those things you're going to have to deal with on some level anytime you place a sleeve on the limb. So this suction with lock, so this is a case where there is a pin locking mechanism in the socket itself, and then you have a pin attached to the liner, and you roll the liner on the limb, and when you slide it inside of the socket, this little pin locks into the locking mechanism of the socket. And that is your suspension. So most of the suspension is very distal, but this is a very convenient way to achieve suspension, and it's preferred by a lot of amputees just due to the fact that they don't have to use the sleeve if they have an issue with perspiration and that sort of thing. But you're not going to get quite as good suspension as if you went to, say, a combination of a valve with a suspension sleeve. So this is just literally having a one-way valve that when your limb slides into the liner, the air inside of the socket is pushed out. And then when you have the sleeve rolled up over it, that seals out the air, and so you get better suction from this system. And then if we went one step further with this concept, and we could possibly use what we call elevated vacuum. And the elevated vacuum is using electronic pump that's attached to the bottom of the prosthesis here. And this electronic pump literally pulls a certain amount of pressure on the socket. It literally will create negative pressure inside of the socket. And arguably, it's the best suspension available for amputees in regards to suspension methods. So again, there's pros and cons. It requires the use of a sleeve, which again, durability of the sleeve can be challenging for some patients. You don't really want to poke holes in this, even though there are ways around this. in regards to the construction of the socket. But there is that consideration, and you have to charge this electronic pump on a daily basis as well. So that's also a consideration. But it will achieve the highest level of suspension, and what I mean by that is the linkage between your socket and the limb. And so a lot of times it might be good for shorter limbs, because the shorter your limb, the less control you have over the prosthesis, and suspension can be a challenge. So again, there are pros and cons to each one of these suspension methods, and this is why you should have a good discussion with your prosthetist about which one he or she thinks will work best for you, and what your opinion on that matter is as well. So transfemoral suspension, very similar here. We'll kind of move through these a little bit quicker because they are very similar to the transtibial suspension methods. But a very basic method would be a belt, and this literally is just a belt that sort of a neoprene belt, a lot of times that will stretch around the waist and attach to the socket of the prosthesis. And a lot of times this isn't even used as the primary suspension method, rather it may be as a secondary suspension method with this method, which would be suction. And suction for an above the knee amputee a lot of times is achieved just with a skin fit. So you literally pull your limb into the socket, and the socket fits snug enough that once your limb is pulled inside, in conjunction with a one-way valve that allows the air to be pushed out, that you will achieve suction from really just the friction between the skin and the socket itself. You also still have the option of the pin lock with above the knee amputees, so this would require obviously the use of a liner that has the pin locking mechanism there that's built into the socket. And then you can also go with elevated vacuum as well with above the knee. This is a little bit more challenging just because you have to seal off the top of the socket. And as I mentioned before, above the knee amputees sit on their socket, so maintaining that seal or keeping the air out of the socket can be a little bit more of a challenge sometimes. But again, this is still going to achieve the sort of the ultimate suspension here by pulling all that air out of the socket and pulling the tissue and liner against the socket wall. So liners, I mentioned this earlier. I would say outside of the advancements in foot technology, that the progression in liner technology has also revolutionized the prosthetic industry. Mainly because the liners go a long way into protecting your limb inside of the socket. And so again, there are different types of liners that use different materials in order to achieve that. One of the oldest and most basic is what we call a P-Lite liner. And basically this is just sort of a polyethylene foam. So it's sort of a foam material. It is custom made, as you can see here. So this will be based off of the shape of your limb, and the prosthetist will fabricate this in their lab. And the good thing about this is that it can be modified. It can be changed as your limb changes. It's not too uncommon to see this used in preparatory prosthetics because the fact that they can modify it so much as your limb changes. But it's also the material can be compressed. Since it is foam, it can compress out relatively easy. And so that's not really optimal for long-term fit sometimes. So the gel liners, which really the material in a gel liner can vary. It can be urethane, or it can be a thermoplastic elastomer, which we see here, or it can be silicone. And again, all these materials are bioinert, so they work well with the skin. And most of them have what we would consider flow properties. So flow properties just means that when you put this liner on and put it inside of your socket, the material, and you put pressure on the socket, the material will flow away from the area of pressure. So this is really what diverts a lot of those shear forces and peak pressures that you're going to occur from normal walking, and help protect your limb. So again, some of these are off the shelf, some of them are custom, and whether or not you get a custom or off the shelf liner is going to depend on your limb shape, and your prosthetist can obviously help determine which one of those you will need. But again, which type of material you'll need is just going to be sort of based off of your individual situation and which one your prosthetist think is going to benefit you most. So just a couple more slides here, and then we're going to move into some questions. But definitely feel like it's very important to speak about managing your own fit, and your prosthetist will certainly help you with this, but you need to be aware of how your fit is at any point of the day. So there's an age-old rule in prosthetic is that once you start feeling severe pain, it's too late. And so what I mean by that, if we take a look at this picture here and we see this opening at the end of this gentleman's limb, and a lot of times this could occur for various reasons. But some of the things that you do have control over in regards to your socket fit is the number of socks you wear. And your prosthetist will educate you about how to change your socks, really how to determine whether or not you need to add a sock or take off a sock. That's probably the most confusing thing sometimes is figuring out, okay, is this pain I'm feeling on the bottom of my limb because I need to add a sock, or do I need to take off a sock? And I'll give you one little tip that I used to show my patients is that you can go to a hardware store and buy like a little tube of silicone putty and just push out a little bit of ball of that and roll it up and put it inside of your socket, and then walk around for a few minutes with that little ball of silicone on the bottom of your socket. And then take your limb back out, and really what you should see is that the ball is compressed, almost fully compressed, but it's not completely squished out. If you can see your sock, if it's squished out so hard that you can see your sock comes through that ball of silicone, then you need to add a sock. If the ball is not compressed, it means you're off the bottom of the socket, and you need to take off a sock. So that's just sort of a quick and dirty way that you can tell whether or not you have the appropriate number of socks. Another is reading your skin. So redness is a very key indicator about the fit of your socket. So it's normal once you initially take off your prosthesis to see spots that have redness because you're just applying pressure to the tissue and skin. But redness that doesn't disappear after about 2 hours, if you have your prosthesis off for 2 hours and the redness doesn't go away, then that's an indication that that side is receiving too much pressure, and you want to contact your prosthetist. You want to nip these things in the bud and catch them sooner or later, because once again, you have an ulcer, then it's too late. And for somebody who might have diabetic skin, that ulcer might take months to heal because of the poor circulation. So hygiene is also a very important topic, and generally speaking, you need to make sure that if you're using one of the gel liners that we talked about before, you want to make sure that you clean your limb and your liner on a daily basis. And it's fine just to use hand soap to do this. I actually really don't even recommend you using alcohol. You can do that every now and then, but alcohol dries the skin out. It'll also dry the material out of the liner a lot of times. So hand soap is fine to do this, but you just want to make sure that you are cleaning those along with your prosthetic socks, which are going to absorb a lot of perspiration throughout the day. You want to clean all of those things on a daily basis. This is just going to eliminate the possibility of some sort of bacterial infection, which does happen quite often, we see in the prosthetic industry. And so good hygiene is certainly very important to the overall health of your limb. And the last thing that I'll really comment on is understanding pain. And so, I've actually heard patients comment or make the comment sometimes and say, well, as an amputee, you just have to learn to live with a certain amount of pain using a prosthesis. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think the goal, certainly for all prosthetists, is probably their goal is to achieve a comfortable fitting socket for you. And unless there's some sort of extenuating circumstance going on with your limb, I think with the technology that we have available today, that should be the goal, and that should be the expectation, is to create a comfortable socket for you. Again, going back to my own personal experience, I knew that if I didn't have a comfortable fitting socket, there was no way I could go out and train 4 hours a day as an elite Paralympic athlete. And so that was very important for me to have that great socket fit, and it really is what I attribute to a lot of my success, not only in sports, but just in life in general, of being able to go out and do those day-to-day things that we like to do. And so that really kind of segue into our last slide here, which is basically encouraging you to go out and absorb as much knowledge as you possibly can. there is a wealth of knowledge out there today that you have access to, which is very different from people in your position in the past. And we've listed some things here that could be very beneficial for you. Susan may even speak a little bit here at the end about the Amputee Coalition Prosthetist Finder. So that's basically a tool on their website that will help new amputees locate a prosthetist in their area. It contains a lot of information about the prosthetists that they have listed on their website. So that's a very valuable tool. But outside of that, as far as areas that you could go to gain more knowledge about the industry, about prosthetics, about politics revolving around amputation and insurance and that sort of thing, prosthetic technology. You could go to professional associations and accreditation bodies, things like ABC, and then of course you have different other organizations like the Academy, AOPA, which is the American Orthotic Prosthetic Association. There's tons of support groups throughout the country, a lot of good ones out there that I know of, in fact. And it's just very important, I think, to associate and talk with other people who's been through similar experiences and gain knowledge and insight from their individual experiences that can certainly help you with yours. And then you also have access to a lot of literature reviews out there. There are a lot of different publications, a lot of magazines that are available to you that can be very helpful in getting more information about the industry, about different technologies, great motivational stories in those publications as well. And then lastly, there's also, you have access to all the vendor websites on the internet. And so these are going to be the folks that develop a lot of the technology that your prosthetist may be considering for you. And so you can go on there yourself and check out a lot of this technology and get a feel for whether or not you think that that technology would benefit you in regards to the goals that you've set for yourself with what you want to do with that prosthesis. So that is the conclusion of the presentation that we have today. And so what I want to do this time, at this point, is really open it up to questions. Hopefully, let me open up the question box here because I know a lot of you may have been typing stuff in. Let me just scroll all the way back up to the top here. Okay, so the first question I see is, how will I be able to view this recording after the GoTo webinar session has ended? Actually, Sue, you might want to answer that. Are you able to chime in here, Sue?
Yes, the Amputee Coalition will be posting a recording of this webinar on our website. We hope we'll be able to get it up by tomorrow. We may be able to get it up actually later today, but I would think by the end of the day tomorrow at the latest. And folks can view this webinar by clicking on the link on our website.
Okay, thank you, Susan. The second question I see here is, this looks like a question directed towards me specifically. Why were you able to stay in your socket for 23 years, which I think is great. What about those who need to lose weight in order to have a healthy lifestyle? So again, the reason I was able to stay in that socket for so long, and it really will address, I think, both of your questions here, was, as I mentioned before, the fact that my weight did not change more than 5 pounds. My situation was a little bit different in that immediately after my amputation, I went back into training for the Paralympics, which, as I mentioned before, I was training about 4 hours a day. So that certainly didn't hurt me in maintaining that consistent body weight, which I know most people aren't going to be doing that level of training on a day-to-day basis. But it does speak to the fact, the importance of, even if you weren't really that great at exercising on a regular basis prior to your amputation, it's a good idea to get back into something after your amputation. And really, I always encourage that it's something that you really enjoy. You know, don't go and jump on a treadmill or something like that if you hate being on a treadmill. You know, go out and walk around your neighborhood with your kids or your family, or hiking, or just some activity that golfing, you know, whatever it is that you enjoyed doing before, those are the activities you should certainly strive to getting back to doing again after your amputation to really kind of help keep your health in check. Let's look at the next question. Would this be available for peer visitors to use for visits? I'm assuming the question is maybe is would this presentation be available to use? And that would really be, Susan, again, I'll direct that towards you, of whether you would give folks access to the actual presentation.
Certainly, if support group leaders wish to click on the link on our website and view the presentation at a support group meeting, or peer visitors want to show it to a person that they're making a peer visit for, that would be just fine. All you need to do is be able to access our website, and you can view the webinar for those purposes.
Great, thanks, Susan. So the next question I see here is I haven't used the prosthetics yet, and I had a double amputation in January of this year. Do you think I will be able to walk with them? And again, not knowing the specifics about your amputation or your circumstances, I'll just speak to in general about bilateral amputees or double amputations. And as a prosthetist, I've fit quite a few of them, and I've seen many below knee, many bilateral amputees return to a high level of function. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but you know, the fastest amputee in the world, Oscar Pistorius, is a bilateral amputee. So he actually qualified for the Olympics because he ran so fast in the 400 meters he could compete with the able-bodied Olympic group. So I guess my comment would be it's certainly achievable. Again, not knowing your specifics about your amputation, but outside of any extenuating circumstances, I wouldn't see why you wouldn't be able to walk as a bilateral amputee. How can I get a copy of this video? I think Susan's already answered that one. You can do that through the Amputation Coalition of America website. Next question here is, are there any quasi-passive or power bionic feet or knees that are active enough for K4? That's a great question, and unfortunately the answer to that question right now is no. Just having worked with one company that makes that kind of prosthetic, and also knowing what else is out there, right now the microprocessor components and the bionic components are really just made primarily for K3 walkers. They weren't made for K4 in regards to high impact running, jumping, or sprinting, and that's mainly to do with the electronics that's inside of the ankle. They weren't really built at this point. It doesn't mean that won't happen over time, but at this stage of the game they weren't really designed for that high impact activity. They were mainly designed for everyday sort of walking. You can do some sort of maybe running, intermittent running or jogging across the street when you need to, but they were mainly just built for sort of normal day-to-day activities versus that high impact activity. Let's look at the next question. Can a person work their way from a K2 to a K3 level? That's a great question, and the answer is absolutely yes. You can work your way from a K2 to a K3 level, and we see this quite often in the industry. And the main thing that's important in this situation is that your prosthetist documents how you progressed from that K2 to the K3 level, because the insurance, if they build a K2 level prosthesis and then they try to bill a K3 level prosthesis, they're going to be challenged by the insurance. And so it's very important that your prosthetist documents some sort of physical test as to how you progressed from a K2 to a K3 level ambulator, but it is certainly possible. Going to look at the next question. So we have one here that says, my sister is a new quadrilateral amputee still recovering. We didn't talk about hands. any thoughts? Which does one do first, hands or feet or both? And that's a great question. And yes, you're right. We didn't touch a lot on upper extremity prosthetics in this presentation. And in regards to your question, it's really going to kind of break down to the upper extremity. You really kind of break down into mechanical and whether or not they're going to use a mechanical or a microprocessor controlled prosthesis. And generally what we find, to be quite honest with you, is that the majority of upper extremity amputees, if they use a prosthesis, wind up using a traditional prosthesis, which a terminal device, or a better lack of the word, a hook. Just because if they are trying to do high function with the prosthesis, they tend to do it faster and better with what we would consider more of that older technology. Just because a lot of the myoelectric upper extremity prosthetics, they take longer to do those functions because there actually has to be certain sort of muscle contractions for that to happen. But not to say that some people don't prefer that higher level of technology. But in regards to what would come first, I would probably assume that they would, if they're qualified for an upper extremity prosthetic, you know, a lot of times they fit all of them at once. They would do the lower extremity prosthetic in conjunction with the upper, but they may certainly take it in stages to get them ambulating first and do their lower extremity prosthetics, and then start working with them on their upper extremity prosthetic and kind of take it from there. So our next question here is, I just scrolled past it. Please address for below the knee amputation using titanium plates attached to the residual stump and a prosthetic that attaches to the plate rather than the sleeve socket suction method. Okay, so it sounds like what you're talking about here is osseointegration. Osseointegration is a relatively new concept in the United States. It's been done more often in Europe. And just to kind of give you a basic idea of what osseointegration is, they literally take a screw and they put it into the bone. So this could be either for a below the knee amputation or above the knee amputation. Theoretically, it could be for upper extremity amputation as well. But they literally they put a screw into the bone itself. They anchor it in the bone, and then it has an attachment for the prosthesis. So this screw comes out of the end of the residual limb and attaches to a component there, and then they will either attach the prosthetic knee or the prosthetic foot to that. So obviously what you're getting away from here is the use of a socket and any other suspension method. And the problem with this procedure, or the challenge with this procedure, is that you constantly have an open wound around the screw that protrudes from the limb. So infection can be very common. There's the possibility of fracturing the bone, which is a risk. And so while there have been successful fittings of this nature, I would still say that at this point it's a very risky procedure, and really should only be considered with folks who have had no success whatsoever with fitting a traditional socket to their limb.
Brian, I'm wondering, we're kind of concerned about time now.
Okay.
If we could maybe do one more question, and then I've noticed the questions are beginning to roll in. I'm wondering if folks could give us their email address and we could respond to the remaining questions via email individually.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Susan. So for those folks that we don't get to your questions, just provide us your email address. I've also included both Susan's and my email address here, and on this final slide that you can have access to as well. So feel free to reach out to us via that method as well. So let's take one more question here. This is actually a good one. We'll end with this one. Probably something that everybody can relate to. I get ingrown hairs often on my residual limb. How do I avoid them? Well, The so ingrown hairs is just really from your hair follicle being pushed back into your limb because of the pressure of the prosthesis. So the first piece of advice I would tell you is do not shave your limb. That will make ingrown hairs worse because the hairs, as they're growing back in, are more brittle and they're shorter, and it's a much higher likelihood that they'll get pushed back into the follicle, which you'll have a higher occurrence of ingrown hairs. So don't shave your limbs. That's the first thing. The only real way, if it's a really big problem, if you get them often and preventing you from using your prosthesis, I have seen patients go in for electrolysis. So they'll go to a dermatologist and they'll actually have the hairs professionally removed. So that's a permanent removal of the hairs. As you can imagine, it takes several visits for that to happen. But you could ultimately have all the hair on your residual limb removed if it was a really bad problem for you. But I would say that's kind of an extreme procedure to go to. Other than that, I think just keeping your limb clean, because the hair follicle becoming clogged could cause the same sort of problem. But just not shaving your limb and keeping your limb clean will go a long ways to helping to prevent that. So at this point, we'll try to wrap up just to be cognizant of everybody's time here. And so I do want to say that I'm sure Susan might have a couple more comments here, but personally, I'd like to thank everybody for coming and giving us the opportunity to speak with you. Hopefully, you've learned some good information today. And again, if you have further questions, happy to help any way I can. Shoot me an email, and I'm sure that Susan will forward some of the other questions as well. Susan?
Yes, I too want to thank everyone for attending. And I especially want to thank you, Brian and Biome, for being a wonderful partner and providing this information to our community. I'll remind everyone that the last slide here has both Brian's and my email addresses, so you can send in questions. As I get them, I will forward them to Brian as well, so we can coordinate the answers. And we will be posting this webinar up on the Amputee Coalition's website for your future viewing. And thank you all for attending.